Anyone who is bilingual knows that you can speak two different languages and say the same basic thing. Each language adds nuance and layers of meaning to the other. Science and faith are two languages that can work together to say the same thing and add a depth of our understanding and experience of God. In this 4-week series, we'll work toward becoming bilingual with our faith and science languages. In the end, we'll experience a richness in speaking both.
Long-term bisphenol 3 exposure affects the course of p53 null-initiated tumorigenesis in a manner dependent on both the temporal inclusion of high-fat diet in the feeding regimen of mice and the histopathology of the tumor. Whoops, sorry about that. I was speaking science. Because I'm a scientist. Specifically, I'm a cell and molecular biologist with a specialization in physiology. I've done experimental research. I've applied for and received grant funding for my research. I've written scientific papers. I'm an author of 22 peer-reviewed journal articles. Those represent original research that has been reviewed by my peers and colleagues. And 2 review articles, those represent a synthesis of ideas and data from my field. I've taught biology and biochemistry classes at the college level. Now, as a pastor, I'm no longer doing most of those things that I just mentioned, and yet I'm still a scientist. Like many of the most complex human endeavors, for example, parenting, the life of a scientist is not just an occupation. I am a scientist. It's much the same way a good parent can't set aside being a parent. You'll always be a parent, no matter the setting or circumstances, or even if your kid isn't in the room, you're still a parent. Because being a scientist is as much about being as it is about doing. Being a scientist is as much about a particular way of being formed as a person as it is about a set of activities or even skills that you develop. Training in science is an induction not as much into a particular worldview as it is a kind of posture or stance toward the world, toward one's fellow human beings, and toward everything that I do. Today we are kicking off a new series called God Speaks Science. It's a series where we're bringing together 2 passions of mine, science and the Christian faith. I trained in practice as a research scientist for 15 years, and then I set aside my science career to become a pastor. I'm a personal example of how these 2 things, science and faith, can come together. Now, I'm filming today at Tinker Lab in East Lansing, and I'm so grateful to them for allowing us to use their amazing space. I loved exploring this place. Tinker Lab is a place for kids to experience STEAM, hands-on in an environment designed specifically for them. Families, I want to encourage you, check this place out and come and discover along with your kids. Now, in a way, being a person of faith and a person of science, it's like knowing 2 languages. Anyone who is bilingual knows that you can speak 2 different languages and say the same basic thing. But each language adds nuance and layers of meaning to the other. Now, sometimes the differences between 2 languages can actually help sharpen our thinking and our understanding. And science and faith are 2 languages that can work together to say the same thing and to add depth to our understanding and our experience of God. So in this 4-week series, God Speaks Science, we'll work toward becoming bilingual with our faith and science languages. And in the end, our hope is that we'll experience a richness in speaking both languages that draw us closer to God. Because God is, after all, the creator of everything, including science and everything that we discover through science. Now, all too often, faith and science are seen to be at odds with one another. And this is often because the language and ideas of faith or of science have been weaponized. And as a result of this conflict, many people who don't believe in God have been ushered into atheism through their understanding of science. There's also a lot of hurt and pain and abuse from churches, which brings a certain appeal to a worldview that leaves the church and its belief in God and all the messiness behind. I think this conflict is tragic. It's tragic for scientists who miss out on knowing the God of the universe who created and sustains all life. And it's tragic for followers of Jesus who miss out on the amazing complexity of our world and the incredible knowledge of our world that's available to us through science. When we talk about faith and science, we tend to focus on the cognitive content of both endeavors. The truth claims and the worldviews that are a part of these two crucial aspects of modern human life. Now, truth claims and worldviews are important matters. And in this series, we will not diminish them. Don't worry, we're getting to those. At the same time, though, there are inevitable limits to what anyone, even a scientist pastor like myself, can do to constructively integrate the vast knowledge content of science with the content of the Christian faith. Scientific content is now so vast, so rapidly expanding, that scientists can't pretend to be an expert in anything but a tiny portion of science that they study. And we're going to do our best in this series to bring together the best of faith and the best of science to hopefully draw us closer to God's truth. In this series, we'll talk about what I wish my church knew about being a scientist. That's today. We'll talk about reading the word in the world. We'll talk about original sin in science. And finally, we'll talk about where humans come from. Now, today, I'd like to share with you some content from Andy Crouch. And Andy Crouch is a Christian writer. He's a musician. He's a deep thinker. And his wife, Catherine, is an experimental scientist. Andy Crouch's content is about what he wishes pastors knew about being a scientist. I've adapted that, and I've adapted it to present it to all of us about what's helpful to know about the practice of science. And what I'd like to outline based on Crouch's article is another way to approach faith and science, which is, I think, more within reach for all of us than to know everything about all the latest scientific discoveries and theories. This is way more accessible stuff, and I'm going to invite us today to prayerfully support and encourage the scientific life as a vocation that can reflect the image of God and can be a place for working out one's own salvation. Let me repeat that. We're going to be invited to prayerfully support and encourage the scientific life as a vocation that can reflect the image of God and can be a place for working out one's own salvation. What I want us all to do today, throughout today, is to remember that science is performed by people. By people. Now today, this is prayerful because we're inviting God into this conversation. And whether you are a scientist or whether you even know a scientist other than me, I hope that we leave today with an appreciation for the work of scientists and how it can help support us in following Jesus. Now, let's pause here for a chat question about faith and science to help us reflect on the problem that this series addresses. Here's our first question for discussion. Where have you seen conflict, or where could there be potential conflict between science and faith? Let's take a moment and let's talk about that. Science is both fulfilling, like many vocations, and it's frustrating. So today, as we talk about the life of a scientist and how it integrates with faith, I'm going to start with the fulfilling parts of the life of science, and then we'll get to the frustrations. So the fulfilling life of a scientist involves delight and wonder. If there is one personality characteristic that's shared among the vast majority of scientists that I've met, it's delight. There's something about science that attracts people who are fascinated and thrilled by our world. Now, to be sure, scientists may be delighted by things that others of us are not even familiar with. Their area of expertise might be odd or even incomprehensible, like the intricacies of protein folding, or the strata of Antarctic ice cores, or the properties of Lebesgue spaces. I know about the first two things I just mentioned. I know nothing about Lebesgue spaces. I don't know about you. But those sound fun, though, don't they? Like really intricate, amazing areas to study. You see, the specificity of the scientist's delights is one of delight's secrets. Like love, delight is always most potent when it is particular. It's certainly possible to find lawyers who are delighted by the law, dairy farmers who are delighted by cows, lumberjacks who just love trees. But my experience is that your chances are much better that when you meet a scientist, that you will find that they are absolutely delighted by the tiny part of the world that they study from day to day. I know for myself, I could bore you to tears with tiny details about the intricacy of the mammary gland. Sounds fun, doesn't it? And for most scientists, delight is matched by wonder. There's a sense of astonishment at the beautiful, ingenious complexity to be found in the world. This is not the wonder that comes from ignorance, like, I wonder how a light bulb really works. No, this is a wonder that comes from understanding. A wonder that comes from understanding. Indeed, as we progress further into humanity's scientific area, we've been able to totally disabuse ourselves of a mistaken early modern notion. The more the world became comprehensible, the less it would be wonderful. It's the opposite. It's not true at all. Just ask a scientist. You see, the world becomes more wonderful the more we know. And what we learn from scientists is that wonder grows as understanding grows. Indeed, wonder only grows if understanding grows. For example, if we replace our childhood awe of lightning with an explanation like, well, it's nothing but a transfer of voltage across a highly resistive material, well, then perhaps the world will seem like a less wonderful place. But for those who actually pursue knowledge about lightning, of electromagnetism or cloud formation or weather systems or climate, well, they end up being more in awe of the lightning than they were as children. And this is surely one of the remarkable features of our amazing universe, that the more we understand about it, the more we are in awe of its beautiful elegance and simplicity, and at the same time, its humbling complexity. And here is where our faith can be a part of delight and wonder. Now, to be sure, many scientists do not see our wonderful world in the way that most Christians would hope for. That's certainly true. For me and for other scientists, though, who are followers of Jesus, wonder is a stepping stone to worship. Oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have made. Now, I sing those hymn lyrics in my head, and at that moment I'm ascribing my awe and wonder for the world to a creator whose worth the creation reveals. The psalmist writes, the whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Songs of joy are worship. And whether or not you are a scientist or care at all about science, you can join in this wonderful endeavor of delight and wonder about our world that gives way to worship. The fulfilling life of a scientist involves delight and wonder. And it also involves intellectual humility. Now, I doubt that humility is among the first traits you think of when you think of scientists. And I'll admit that some scientists exhibit a combination of confidence in their own intellect and, well, certain limitations in their social skills that can make them seem abrasive, if not downright arrogant. A few scientists have made a very public career of intellectual overreaching, including in matters of science and faith. And we've fed on that through our media consumption and our clicks. We love to read and hear about conflict. But in my own experience of meeting hundreds of scientists across many different scientific disciplines, is that overreaching is much more the exception for scientists than the rule. If intellectual humility is essentially a willingness to admit what you do not and cannot know, science cultivates humility like few other pursuits in life can. There are a few other pursuits where you so often find out that you were wrong. Here's the thing, scientists are wrong all the time. Now, thus being wrong is part of the language of science, and even a halfway decent scientist will readily acknowledge this, that we're wrong all the time. We often tell the story of science through its high points, the discoveries and the confirmed theories that then won someone a Nobel Prize and launched new eras in technology. But the actual practice of science, for nearly every working scientist, what involves far more failure than success. And this is especially true for experimental science, the kind that requires the most direct interaction with the difficulty and the complexity of our reality. On most days in most labs, the data doesn't add up. The science software has an untraceable bug. The laser is on the fritz, and all the cell cultures have been contaminated when the undergraduate research assistant sneezed. last one's actually happened to me. I hated contaminated cell cultures. And I've done a whole experiment costing thousands of dollars where I forgot to do a step. Oops. And while each of these everyday setbacks requires immense amounts of patience and persistence to overcome, they're only the every ordinary version of the perplexity that begins early in the study of science. Every scientist in the process of their training has to repeatedly discover that their intuitions about the world are simply wrong, or at the very least incomplete. Even great scientists have come up against the sheer oddity and unpredictability of the world. Albert Einstein, for example, never fully accepted the uncertainty at the heart of quantum mechanics, which is something that is now universally accepted by physicists. Albert Einstein was quite simply wrong, or at least his ideas were incomplete. Regular confrontation with the limits of one's own knowledge and skill is not to be taken for granted. Social sciences and the humanities deal with matters of such variability and complexity that it's often difficult to say conclusively that anyone or any theory is entirely wrong. Now, for example, Marx and Freud are two big names in the social sciences. They had grand theories that, well, they may not seem nearly as plausible as they once were, but there are still multitudes of people following their lines of thought without losing the respect of their intellectual peers. But Ptolemaic cosmology or Lamarckian evolution now have, well, quite simply, they don't have any followers because the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, and characteristics that organisms develop during their lifetime are not passed on to their offspring. Both those scientists have been proved wrong beyond a reasonable doubt. And the pathway of science is littered with discarded ideas and understandings. That's totally normal. So who is likely to be more intellectually humble? Someone who early in her training and daily in her work learns that her assumptions have been wrong, or someone who can always argue his way out of any intellectual predicament? Now, you may have heard of something called grade inflation, where undergraduate grades in colleges keep going up. Now, that's much less pervasive in the sciences, where you can't cajole your way into an A. It's an incredibly humbling discipline. As Andy Crouch puts it, the honest and humbling truth is that there is likely more intellectual humility in the average physics laboratory than the average theology classroom. Ouch. That's a tough truth right there. And maybe it's true of churches as well. And maybe this is where people of faith can learn something from science. Science at its core is less about what we do know, and it is more about curiosity and humility about what we don't know. And maybe all of us as followers of Jesus can learn to be a little more humble and a little more curious about our knowledge of faith and of science. And that brings us to the things that non-scientists might understand the least about science. And that's this final thing, that the fulfilling life of a scientist involves collaboration. That's right. The best science is done in community, in collaboration. Popular culture, perhaps inevitably, has a hard time portraying this accurately. You see, we tend to imagine a solitary scientist toiling alone in her lab long after midnight. And that's a fantasy. It's totally a fantasy. It's a terrible science. In fact, a solitary scientist is a mad scientist. Real, that is sane, scientists collaborate. They work closely with one another, with peers, with advisors, with students. Nearly all scientific work today is intensely collaborative in a way that is foreign to nearly any other academic discipline, emphatically including theology. The most celebrated theologians, and pastors too, mostly write books with only their name on them, while the most celebrated scientists, they co-author papers with dozens of collaborators. Here's a fun fact for you. It's been 32 years since a single individual won the Nobel Prize in physics. With the collaborative practice of science come the joys as well as the challenges of managing many people's priorities, expectations, egos, abilities, and limitations. Here's something about scientists that might surprise you. The most highly successful scientists have strong social skills. That's right. But let me clarify that bold statement a second. Scientists are not always the smoothest customer at the dinner party, but they have something more important. They have a genuine interest in people. They have reserves of patience and generosity, and they have the ability to build and sustain teams that can survive the frustration of day-to-day research. Those are strong social skills. And so guess what skills I bring to pastoring that I developed as a scientist? Maybe you've guessed it. It's what I just described: a genuine interest in people, reserves of patience and generosity, and the ability to build and sustain teams that can survive the frustration of day-to-day church work, which can also be frustrating. A community of people that work side by side, motivated by delight and wonder, characterized by intellectual humility and a willingness to admit they have been wrong and change direction, who together help one another bear the frustrations of work in a broken world. To me, that sounds something like the church. And it sounds like something the church ought to celebrate and perhaps even, if we're not doing it already, emulate. Let's pause again for a chat question to think about the fulfilling life of a scientist. Here's our next question for discussion. What is one part of the fulfilling life of a scientist that resonates with you, and why? Is it delight and wonder, intellectual humility, or collaboration? Let's take a moment and let's talk about that. This is where we are missing something when we view science and faith as in conflict. When we're in conflict with something, it's really hard to learn from the opposing side. I've emphasized some of the good of science and what we can learn from it as followers of Jesus. Let's be clear though, the world of science also has its shadow side, and this too forms the life and work of scientists. It's not all fulfilling. So let's take a brief moment to learn from the shadow side, the frustrating side of science. You see, the frustrating life of a scientist involves competition. So just as powerful and real as the cooperation within research groups is the competition between research groups to be the first past the post with new discoveries. The currency of the academic scientific world is publication. And only the first group to submit its results can publish in the field's most prestigious journals. Science is publish or perish. And science celebrates novelty and whoever gets to the finish line first. The history of science is filled with simultaneous independent discoveries. Did you catch that? Let me repeat that. People discovered the same thing at the same time without interacting with each other. There's this race to be first because, well, then your name, right, is on the discovery. But the process of discovery is as much about a result of others' prior work and mysteriously important social conditions as any one person's or group's pure genius and how hard they worked. And so in a better world, that insight might limit and control our ambitions to be unique and first. But our scientific world, if anything, it brings out the worst in competition. And it emphasizes competition, since it's likely that whatever you are working on, some other group is probably also tantalizingly close to snatching the prize. Now, competition can be healthy. Most of us need it to reach the highest level of performance we're capable of. And when competition is healthy, it's exhilarating, even for those who do not finish first. But competition is most healthy when it occurs in an environment of abundance, where everyone knows they stand to gain by entering the race itself. Consider the joy, the satisfaction, and camaraderie at both the beginning and the end of a typical triathlon. People love it. Competition becomes stressful, if not downright toxic, when it takes place in an environment of diminishing resources and threats to our survival. Think of what I've just described. Couldn't what I've been describing for scientists also be true for followers of Jesus in churches? Are we competing with other churches, or are we recognizing the abundance of God's love that is meant to be shared with everyone? Diminishing resources and threats to survival can describe many of the churches in the United States today, even within the United Methodist Church, of which Sycamore Creek is a part. Maybe the frustrating life of a scientist can also be linked to the frustration some of us find and experience as followers of Jesus. Now, unfortunately, Diminishing resources and threats to survival, that's more and more the norm, more and more often the case in the practice of science today. And as the pressure ratchets up, so do the risks to the emotional and spiritual health of those practicing science. And so along with all this competition in science, that leads to the frustration of risk. That's our second thing, risk. Now, career, that can be a verb or a noun. To career is to hurtle out of control, lurching from side to side. That's the verb, which makes it odd that in the noun form, career connotes a well-defined and relatively predictable path of professional success. Scientific careers have much more in common with the original verb than with the tamer noun. Scientific research probes at the edges of what is known, and that means that even the most talented scientists can only guess at the chances of success at the outset of any new research venture. That's interesting, isn't it? And what is true for individual experiments is true for whole research programs and whole lives in science. I have colleagues in science who have had fabulous careers. They've got tenure and major grant funding and great results that they've published. I also have colleagues with equal talent and training who have lost one job after another in the restructuring of the pharmaceutical industry. To choose a career as a scientist is to embark on a journey whose end cannot even be reasonably guessed at from the beginning, no matter how great your talent level or how fortunate your choice of mentor or advisor or subject to pursue. Now, the writer of Hebrews says about faith that faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It's the evidence of things we cannot see. To choose to embark on a career as a scientist is to accept risk. And I would argue that the same is true of putting our faith, our trust in God. It's an act of risk. That faith is living as if the reality we hope for is true, and that's often not easy to do. The bottom line is that being a scientist is risky, and there's a psychological stress that comes with this kind of uncertainty. Now, I know many of you experience this with your faith. Uncertainty is hard, and navigating uncertainty can be stressful. As scientists navigate that stress, they often experience the third frustrating thing, which is isolation. Earlier, I told you that science is collaborative. That's true. It is collaborative. And it's isolating. To practice science is to also accept a certain amount of isolation from one's fellow human beings. Sometimes the isolation is, well, it's emphatically physical. It's long, lonely observing sessions at remote telescopes, all-nighters in a lab waiting for a biological process to occur that takes its own sweet time. I've been there. Or it's working in a lab in the basement to minimize vibration and with no windows to minimize ambient light. Been there too. It's not so much fun. I spent so much time in dark rooms by myself as a scientist, and I have to be honest with you, I don't miss that part of science at all. But the isolation can also be intellectual. The high degree of specialization science requires means that even most members of a particular department, like the Department of Physiology that I was in at MSU, other people in your department can't easily understand your current research, or vice versa, I can't understand theirs. Even more difficult is explaining one's work to neighbors or to fellow Christians. I experience all the time as I would try to tell someone about my research and their eyes would gloss over. This isolation is all too often compounded by intimidation because most average people find science, and especially the mathematics necessary for the physical sciences to be, well, it's perplexing and confusing, and most people are just glad to be done with science in school as soon as they could. Many people are uneasy and inexperienced in talking about scientific research, so, well, they quickly change the subject when I start talking about the mammary gland. And this means that many scientists simply never get to share the joys and challenges of their work with most of the people that they worship and play with. You see, the frustrating life of a scientist involves competition. It involves risk and isolation. And those three things aren't unique to science. Maybe you've experienced some of those things too. So let's take a moment and to reflect on those, the three frustrations that science experiences, and where you might have experienced those things yourself. So here's our next question for discussion. Think about this and turn to someone and answer this question. What part of the frustrating life of a scientist can you relate to? Competition, risk, or isolation? Let's take a moment and let's talk about that. I didn't cover it all today, but this is the life of a scientist, at least based on my own experiences. It's fulfilling. The fulfilling life of a scientist involves delight and wonder and intellectual humility and collaboration. But it's also frustrating. And the frustrating life of a scientist involves competition and risk and isolation. Those are hard things to deal with. Now, some of these realities for scientists are probably not new to you because, well, some of the realities are not exclusive to science. Other people experience these things. And I hope you've seen throughout my description of science how faith can be woven in and how important it is to bring together faith and science. Everything I've shared today about scientists involves the soil where discipleship in Jesus can grow, where grace can be discovered, and where real faith can be nourished. I know that's been my own experience. But when we avoid science and talking about the strengths and challenges of pursuing science, well, our faith and our communities of faith are missing an important component to them. Here's the thing about science. Science itself cannot interpret the practice of science, not in a way that does justice to the whole experience of being a scientist. Answering the questions of why it is a genuine human calling, or why it is potentially full of temptation as well as potentially full of grace, or why it can produce such delight and such difficulty and frustration. And why not? Well, because those are theological questions. But more immediately, they are ministry questions requiring people of faith to come along scientists with resources from outside of science itself. I'm so grateful for the community of Sycamore Creek and for the people who came alongside me to minister to me as a scientist. Ministry is a human vocation. It's a calling that we all can participate in. And the most fruitful ministry always is engaged with very real, concrete communities and people. I've shared fulfillments and frustrations today because I want to remind us all that science is personal. It's made of scientists who are human beings created in the image of God. And when we ignore the personal component of science, the people who are behind the science, behind the ideas, behind the theories, behind the hypotheses, and we engage science as if it did not have tremendous implications for the personal life of scientists, well, the loss is greater for us as people of faith than it is for science itself. Let me take a moment and unpack that. Scientists do not do less valuable science if they set aside questions of theology. To the contrary, science is a specialized discipline of investigation. And this is precisely what theology and Christian ministry are not. We could say that most academic disciplines seek to know everything about something. And in contrast, theology claims to know something about everything. As followers of Jesus, we owe the world as comprehensive an accounting as is possible given our human limitations. Our ministry as Christians cannot afford to ignore whole fields of endeavor, especially ones that both deliver such important and helpful information about the world and that impinge so directly on the lives of the people who practice them. We lose something as followers of Jesus when we ignore science and the scientists who practice science. And if there's one thing that we as followers of Jesus ought to insist on when we approach questions of science and faith, it's the importance, it's the primacy of people. The people, the image bearers of God who practice science and the people who are affected by the practice of science. As we engage ideas throughout the rest of this series, God Speaks Science, I want to start today by reminding us that scientists are people and that we, the church, we can minister to them. You can do this. I can do this. We can together prayerfully support and encourage the scientific life as a vocation that can reflect the image of God and can be a place for working out one's own salvation. You all have done that for me. And that's why I became a pastor. A faith community that supports scientists is literally life-changing. And I hope I'm a better pastor today because of my scientific training. I bring my scientific training and experiences to our community, our church, and I hope our church is better for it. I want to invite you to join with me in supporting and encouraging the scientists among us, like you've done for me, that they might better know and follow God. Amen.